Chapter 1. Shadows in the Snow. The storm arrived without warning, a sudden and fierce cascade of ice and wind that consumed the landscape in a shroud of white. Snow fell in heavy sheets, swirling like restless spirits in the howling gale, as if the winter itself had decided to erase the world's edges. Somewhere in the chaos of the blizzard, a lone figure trudged forward, each step an act of defiance against nature's fury. Lena hadn't planned for this journey to lead her here. In fact, she hadn't planned much at all. Her departure from the bustling city was abrupt, marked by a single suitcase and a trail of unanswered questions. It was not an escape, she told herself, but a search for something undefined. Yet here she was, wandering through an unyielding storm, her destination a vague memory, and her hope as fragile as the frosted branches overhead. The cabin appeared like a mirage, its dark silhouette barely visible against the blinding snow. At first, Lena thought it a trick of her frozen mind, but as she drew closer, the structure grew more distinct. A modest shelter with a pitched roof, its windows frosted and its chimney puffing faint wisps of smoke. Relief surged through her. Whoever lived here would surely grant her refuge, even if only until the storm passed. Inside the cabin, Nathan's world was equally insular. The solitary warmth of the fireplace flickered against the wooden walls, casting elongated shadows that danced like phantoms. He had come here to be alone, to find solace in the stillness that eluded him elsewhere. His past lay coiled like a serpent in his thoughts, hissing memories he longed to silence. The cabin, with its crackling fire and rustic simplicity, was a sanctuary, or at least, it had been until the knock on the door. It was tentative at first, barely audible over the storm's roar. Nathan froze, his heart thudding in time with the wind's relentless pounding. Another knock followed, louder this time, insistent. Slowly, he rose, his movements cautious, and opened the door to reveal a figure cloaked in snow and desperation. Lena's face was pale, her lips trembling as she spoke words Nathan could barely hear. He stepped aside, motioning her in without hesitation. The storm clawed at the doorway as she stumbled inside, bringing with her a gust of icy air and a sense of something unspoken, something fragile yet unbreakable. Nathan shut the door firmly, sealing them both inside the small cabin that now seemed far too intimate. Time moved differently in the wake of the storm. Hours blended into one another, measured only by the hiss of the fire and the steady drip of melted snow pooling by the door. Lena shed her coat and sat near the hearth, her hands extended toward the flames as color gradually returned to her cheeks. Nathan busied himself with small tasks, boiling water, setting out a blanket, anything to avoid the questions that hung between them like unseen wires. It was then that he noticed it, a sprig of mistletoe dangling from the low beam above the fireplace. Nathan frowned. He hadn't put it there. In fact, he was certain it hadn't been there before. The small, waxy leaves and white berries seemed almost to shimmer in the firelight, as though aware of their own improbability. Lena saw it too. Her gaze lingered on the mistletoe, her brow furrowing in confusion. Neither of them spoke of it, but the air between them grew heavier, charged with a tension neither could name. Outside, the storm raged on, isolating them from the world and binding them to the mysteries of the cabin. As the evening deepened, Nathan brought her a cup of tea, their hands brushing briefly in the exchange. A strange sensation bloomed in that fleeting touch, a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. For an instant, they both paused, their eyes meeting as if caught in the grip of something larger than themselves. But then, just as suddenly, the feeling evaporated. Lena blinked, her expression clouding with uncertainty. Nathan's hand fell to his side, and he stepped back, the moment slipping away like smoke through a cracked window. "Where am I?" Lena whispered, the question slipping out before she could stop it. She didn't mean the cabin or even the storm, but something deeper, something she couldn't quite grasp. Nathan hesitated. His response caught somewhere between honesty and deflection. "Safe," he said finally. "You're safe." It wasn't a lie, but it wasn't the truth either. Neither of them felt truly safe. Not from the storm, not from the past, and certainly not from the peculiar mistletoe that now seemed to watch them from above. The snow continued to fall outside, relentless and unyielding, burying the world in silence. And in that silence, the shadows deepened. Chapter 2. Echoes of Frost. Morning came slowly, the storm's fury easing into a restless quiet. The snow lay thick and heavy, draping the cabin in an otherworldly stillness. Nathan stood by the window, his breath fogging the glass as he peered out into the vast whiteness. The world beyond the cabin was an impenetrable expanse, its boundaries erased by the storm's handiwork. For the first time in years, he felt truly untethered, a small dot adrift in an endless void. Behind him, the crackle of the fire was the only sound. Lena still slept, curled beneath a worn quilt on the small couch. Her face, serene in slumber, betrayed none of the turmoil she carried. Nathan watched her for a moment, noting the way the morning light painted her features in soft hues. She looked as if she belonged here, as if the cabin had been waiting for her arrival all along. A sharp knock at the window startled him. He turned quickly, but the frost-covered panes revealed nothing. His pulse quickened, and he strained his ears, listening for any sound that might explain the noise. The quiet was oppressive, broken only by the faint whistle of wind seeping through the cabin's cracks. He shook his head, chalking it up to a stray branch or the settling snow. When Lena stirred, her movement was tentative, as if she were reluctant to leave the fragile cocoon of sleep. She sat up slowly, her eyes scanning the room with a fleeting expression of unfamiliarity before settling on Nathan. For a brief moment, they regarded each other in silence, a fragile understanding passing between them. Then, as if by unspoken agreement, they turned their attention to the small tasks of morning, tending the fire, preparing a simple meal, and shaking off the remnants of the night. The mistletoe was still there, hanging from its improbable perch above the fireplace. Its presence felt more insistent now, its glossy leaves and pale berries standing out starkly against the cabin's muted tones. Neither Nathan nor Lena mentioned it, yet both found their eyes drawn to it repeatedly, as though it held an unspoken secret. Lena's memory was a strange, shifting thing. She recalled the storm vividly, its ferocity, the way it swallowed her path, but everything before that felt distant, like a story she had once heard but couldn't quite place. Nathan's cabin was both alien and oddly familiar, a paradox she couldn't resolve. She found herself moving through the space cautiously, as if afraid to disturb something fragile and unseen. Nathan, for his part, was equally unsettled. The knock at the window lingered in his mind, a nagging whisper he couldn't ignore. He tried to focus on practical matters, clearing snow from the porch, checking the meager supplies in the pantry. But his thoughts kept circling back to the mistletoe and the peculiar tension it seemed to exude. It wasn't just a plant. It felt alive, as though it were watching, waiting. By midday, the storm's remnants had settled into a gentle snowfall. The world outside the cabin was eerily quiet, muffled by the thick blanket of snow. Nathan ventured out briefly to gather wood, the cold biting at his skin despite his layers. The landscape was unrecognizable, the forest's edges blurred into the horizon. He worked quickly, the weight of isolation pressing on him with every step. Inside, Lena explored the cabin's modest interior. The walls were adorned with simple decorations, a faded photograph, a pair of antlers, a small clock that ticked unevenly. She found a bookshelf tucked into the corner, its contents a mix of weathered novels and forgotten trinkets. One item caught her eye, a journal bound in cracked leather. She hesitated before picking it up, the weight of it surprising in her hands. The pages were filled with neat, precise handwriting, the ink faded but legible. The entry spoke of solitude, of a man seeking refuge from a world that had grown too loud, too chaotic. There were mentions of storms, of seasons passing in quiet succession, and of a peculiar plant that seemed to defy explanation. As she read, a chill crept up her spine, though the fire burned bright and warm. When Nathan returned, snow dusted across his shoulders. He found Lena sitting by the fire with the journal open in her lap. She looked up at him, her expression unreadable. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence stretching like a taut wire between them. Then she closed the journal gently, setting it aside as if it were a fragile relic. "This cabin," she said softly, more to herself than to him. "It's seen so much." Nathan didn't respond. He couldn't. The weight of her words, the truth they hinted at, settled over him like the snow outside. Instead, he moved to the fireplace, his eyes drawn once again to the mistletoe. It swayed gently, though there was no breeze to move it, its presence both a comfort and a menace. As the day waned, the cabin seemed to shrink, its walls pressing closer with the encroaching night. The fire's glow softened, casting long shadows that flickered and danced like restless spirits. Nathan and Lena sat in silence, each lost in their own thoughts, the mistletoe hanging between them like a question left unanswered. Outside, the snow fell steadily, burying the world in quiet oblivion. And within the cabin, the echoes of frost lingered, whispering secrets neither of them was ready to hear. Chapter 3: A Cabin for Two. The night fell swiftly, as if the storm had dragged the darkness down with it. Outside, the snow had ceased its relentless descent, leaving the world blanketed in an eerie, untouched silence. The moon's pale light spilled through the frost-glazed windows, casting soft shadows across the cabin's modest interior. Nathan sat by the fire, absently feeding logs into the glowing embers, the crackle of burning with the only sound to punctuate the stillness. Lena, perched on the edge of the couch, watched him from across the room. Though she had been there for hours, she still felt like an interloper, her presence an intrusion on Nathan's carefully cultivated solitude. Yet the cabin, with its worn furnishings and lingering warmth, had begun to feel oddly familiar, as if it had been waiting for her arrival as much as it had sheltered him. Above them, the mistletoe remained suspended, a quiet sentinel over their uneasy companionship. Its glossy leaves seemed to glisten in the firelight, the white berries glimmering like pearls. Neither Nathan nor Lena acknowledged it aloud, yet its presence was impossible to ignore. It hung between them like an unspoken question, its weight palpable despite its small size. Lena shifted, the quilt she had wrapped around herself falling slightly as she leaned forward. The firelight played tricks on her mind, casting strange shapes on the walls and ceiling. She thought she saw movement in the shadows, a flicker, a shimmer that vanished the moment she focused on it. She blinked, shaking off the thought, but unease lingered at the edges of her awareness. Nathan finally broke the silence, his voice low and gravelly. "It's been years since I've had company here." Though his tone was even, there was a vulnerability in his words that caught Lena off guard. She hesitated, unsure of how to respond. "I didn't mean to intrude," she said softly. "The storm. I didn't have anywhere else to go." "You're not intruding," he replied, a hint of something, reluctance, perhaps, in his voice. "The storm has a way of bringing people together." A faint smile touched Elena's lips, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "And keeping them there," she added, her gaze drifting toward the window. The snow outside seemed to stretch endlessly, an impassable barrier that held them in place. Nathan's eyes followed hers, and for a moment, they sat in silence, the weight of their isolation settling over them. The cabin, small as it was, seemed to expand and contract with their breaths, its walls both a refuge and a prison. Elena pulled the quilt tighter around her shoulders. "This place, it feels different," she murmured, almost to herself. "Like it's alive." Nathan glanced at her, his expression unreadable. "It's the quiet," he said after a moment. "When you're alone long enough, the silence starts to take on a life of its own." She nodded but said nothing, her thoughts drifting. There was a truth to his words, but it wasn't just the silence. The cabin itself seemed imbued with something more, a presence that defied explanation. It was in the way the shadows moved, in the way the firelight danced, and in the persistent, inexplicable mistletoe that hung overhead. As the night deepened, Nathan rose to stoke the fire, the warm glow casting his face in sharp relief. Elena watched him, noting the tension in his shoulders, the way he carried himself as if weighed down by unseen burdens. She wondered what had brought him here, to this remote corner of the world, to this life of isolation. But the question remained unasked, lingering in the quiet between them. When he turned back to her, his gaze lingered on the mistletoe. "That wasn't here before," he said quietly, more to himself than to her. Elena followed his gaze, her brow furrowing. "What do you mean?" "I've lived here for years," he said, his voice edged with unease. "I've never seen it before tonight." The air seemed to grow heavier, the crackle of the fire suddenly loud in the oppressive silence. Elena's pulse quickened, a sense of unease creeping over her. "It's just mistletoe," she said, though the words felt hollow even as she spoke them. Nathan's eyes met hers, and for a moment, they held each other's gaze. There was a question in his eyes, unspoken but unmistakable. She looked away first, her thoughts swirling like snowflakes caught in the wind. Time passed in fits and starts, the hours stretching and compressing in the peculiar way they do when there is nothing to mark their passing. The fire burned low, its embers glowing faintly in the hearth. Outside, the wind had stilled, leaving a silence so profound it seemed to echo within the cabin's walls. Nathan finally rose, his movements slow and deliberate. "You should rest," he said, his voice softer now. "The storm's passed, but the snow will make travel impossible for a while." Elena nodded, though sleep felt like a distant concept. She stretched out on the couch, pulling the quilt over her, the fire's fading warmth lulling her into a fragile sense of calm. Nathan settled into a chair by the window, his silhouette stark against the pale glow of moonlight. As the cabin settled into stillness, the mistletoe swayed gently, though no breeze stirred the air. Its presence remained, a quiet enigma that neither Nathan nor Elena could fully ignore. And as the night deepened, the cabin seemed to breathe, its walls alive with secrets that waited patiently to be uncovered. Chapter 4. The Glow of Forgotten Fires. Dawn crept into the cabin slowly, its arrival muffled by the thick layer of snow that covered the landscape. The light filtered through the frost-coated windows in a pale, subdued glow, illuminating the room with a ghostly hue. Nathan woke first, his body stiff from the uneven chair by the window. His breath puffed in the cold morning air, mingling with the faint tendrils of smoke still rising from the fireplace. Elena was still curled on the couch, the quilt pulled tightly around her. Her face was soft in repose, the faint lines of worry and uncertainty smoothed by sleep. Nathan's eyes lingered on her for a moment longer than he intended before he turned his attention to the fire. The embers had nearly died, a faint warmth emanating from the hearth. He moved with practiced efficiency, adding kindling and logs until the flames roared back to life, filling the cabin with much-needed heat. The mistletoe still hung above the fireplace, its glossy leaves catching the firelight and casting tiny shadows on the wall. Nathan's gaze flickered to it as he worked. Something about it set his teeth on edge. It wasn't just its sudden appearance. There was an air of wrongness about it, as though it didn't quite belong in the world as he knew it. A soft sound drew his attention. Lena stirred, her eyes fluttering open. For a moment, she looked disoriented, her gaze darting around the room as though she'd forgotten where she was. Then her eyes met Nathan's, and recognition settled over her features. "Good morning," he said, his voice low. She sat up slowly, the quilt falling away to reveal her disheveled hair and the faint shadows under her eyes. "Morning," she replied, her voice raspy with sleep. Her gaze shifted to the fire, and she extended her hands toward it, letting the warmth seep into her fingers. The silence between them was not uncomfortable, but it was heavy with unspoken thoughts. Outside, the snow was blindingly white, the sunlight bouncing off its surface in dazzling arcs. The world beyond the cabin was pristine, untouched, and utterly inhospitable. Nathan's thoughts turned to the supplies they had left. He'd planned for himself, not for two people, and the sudden arrival of another had complicated matters. As if sensing his thoughts, Lena spoke. "Thank you for letting me stay," she said quietly. "I know I've disrupted your life here." Nathan shook his head. "You couldn't have known the storm would hit, and no one should be out in that alone." Her lips curved in a faint smile, though her eyes remained serious. "Still, I appreciate it." The conversation faltered, leaving them once again in the quiet embrace of the cabin. Nathan busied himself with preparing a simple breakfast from their dwindling stores, while Lena rose and began to explore the small space. Her movements were tentative, as though she feared disturbing something sacred. Her gaze landed on the mistletoe. She paused, her head tilting as she studied it. "Has that always been there?" she asked, glancing at Nathan. He hesitated before answering. "No, it showed up the night you arrived." Lena frowned, her fingers brushing lightly against the quilt wrapped around her. "That's odd. Mistletoe doesn't just appear out of nowhere." Nathan nodded, his lips pressed into a thin line. "I've been trying not to think about it." Her frown deepened, but she didn't press the matter. Instead, she turned her attention to the window, her breath fogging the glass as she looked out at the endless expanse of snow. Something about the landscape unsettled her. It wasn't just the isolation. It was the sense that they were being watched, though she couldn't explain why she felt that way. Breakfast was a quiet affair, the sound of utensils against plates the only break in the stillness. Afterward, Nathan ventured outside to clear some of the snow from the cabin's entrance. The air was biting, the cold seeping through his gloves as he worked. His thoughts swirled like the snowflakes that still fell intermittently, drifting between the practical and the inexplicable. Inside, Lena found herself drawn to the leather-bound journal she discovered the previous day. She opened it carefully, the pages brittle with age. The entries were short, written in a steady hand that grew shakier with time. They spoke of solitude, of the beauty and brutality of the wilderness, and of a creeping sense of unease that the writer couldn't shake. One entry in particular caught her attention. "There is something in the air tonight, something I cannot name. It feels as though the forest itself is holding its breath, waiting. I found a sprig of mistletoe above the hearth this morning. I did not put it there." Her fingers tightened on the journal's spine. The words sent a chill through her, though the fire burned steadily a few feet away. She read the entry again, her mind racing. The mistletoe, the sense of being watched, the strange familiarity of the cabin. It all felt connected, though she couldn't yet see how. When Nathan returned, his face red from the cold, she showed him the journal. He read the entry silently, his brow furrowing as his eyes scanned the page. "It's not just us," she said quietly. "Whoever wrote this, they felt it too." Nathan closed the journal, his expression grim. "I don't know what it means," he admitted, "but we need to be careful." The day passed slowly, the weight of the journal's words hanging over them. They spoke little, each lost in their own thoughts. Outside, the snow glowed in the fading light, the world growing colder and darker with each passing hour. That night, as the fire burned low and the shadows deepened, the mistletoe swayed again. Neither Nathan nor Lena saw it move, but they both felt the shift in the air. The cabin seemed to breathe, its walls alive with whispers too soft to hear. And as they drifted into uneasy sleep, the sense of being watched remained, an invisible presence that neither of them could escape. Chapter 5. Threads of the Unknown. The night was colder than any before, as though the storm had stolen the warmth from the earth itself. The fire in the hearth struggled to hold back the creeping chill that seemed to seep through the very walls of the cabin. Nathan lay awake in his chair by the window, his eyes fixed on the faint glimmers of moonlight reflecting off the snow. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them, something unseen but undeniable. Lena was restless, her sleep disturbed by dreams she couldn't remember. She shifted beneath the quilt, her face etched with unease. The journal sat on the small table beside her, its weathered pages heavy with secrets she wasn't sure she wanted to uncover. Above the hearth, the mistletoe hung motionless, yet its presence felt alive, almost sentient, as if it were aware of their every move. The shadows in the cabin seemed to deepen as the hours passed, the flickering firelight casting distorted shapes on the walls. Nathan's thoughts drifted to the journal entry Lena had shown him earlier. The writer's words lingered in his mind like a persistent echo. The forest itself is holding its breath, waiting. A creak broke the silence, sharp and sudden. Nathan sat up, his muscles tensing as his eyes scanned the room. The sound had come from somewhere inside the cabin, but he couldn't pinpoint its source. He glanced at Lena, who had stirred at the noise but hadn't woken. For a moment, he considered waking her, but he decided against it. Whatever was happening, he didn't want to alarm her until he understood it himself. Rising from his chair, Nathan moved quietly, his footsteps soft against the wooden floor. The cabin was small, but in the dim light, it felt vast and unfamiliar. He checked the door and windows, finding them secure. The cold wind outside howled faintly, but inside, the air was still, too still. He turned his attention to the mistletoe, its dark green leaves and pale berries untouched yet strangely imposing. It was as if the plant's presence had rooted itself not just in the cabin but in his mind. Nathan reached out hesitantly, his fingers stopping just short of the mistletoe. A strange sensation washed over him, a fleeting disorientation that made the room spin. He pulled his hand back sharply, his breath hitching. Something was wrong. He could feel it, though he couldn't explain how or why. Behind him, Lena stirred again, this time waking with a sharp intake of breath. "Nathan," she called softly, her voice laced with drowsy confusion. He turned to her, his expression guarded. "I'm here," he said. "Go back to sleep." But she didn't. Instead, she sat up, clutching the quilt around her shoulders. "I heard something," she murmured, her eyes searching his face for answers. Nathan hesitated before nodding. "I heard it too. Probably just the cabin settling." Elena's gaze shifted to the mistletoe, and her brow furrowed. "It's that thing, isn't it?" she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's not normal." Nathan didn't answer immediately. Instead, he moved to the table, picking up the journal. He flipped through its pages, his eyes scanning the entries for anything that might offer clarity. But the words only deepened the mystery. The writer had chronicled a growing unease, a sense of being watched, and strange occurrences that defied explanation. Each entry felt like a warning, but one too cryptic to heed. Lena rose from the couch and joined him, her presence a quiet comfort against the oppressive weight of the cabin. She leaned over the journal, her eyes flicking over the same words Nathan had read. "It's all connected," she said, her voice firm despite the fear in her eyes. "The mistletoe, the cabin, the forest." Nathan nodded. "But how? And why?" Before Elena could respond, another sound echoed through the cabin, a low, resonant hum that seemed to emanate from the very walls. Both of them froze, their eyes meeting in mutual alarm. The sound grew louder, pulsing in a rhythm that felt almost alive. It wasn't like any noise Nathan had ever heard before, and it sent a chill down his spine. "It's coming from the mistletoe," Elena whispered, her voice trembling. Nathan's eyes snapped to the plant. It remained still, but the hum seemed to vibrate in the air around it. He took a step closer, his heart pounding. The sensation of disorientation returned, stronger this time, as if the mistletoe were pulling at the edges of his mind. Elena reached out and grabbed his arm. "Don't," she said urgently. "We don't know what it is." "That's exactly why I need to," Nathan replied, though his voice wavered. He reached out again, his hand trembling as it neared the plant. The hum intensified, and the room seemed to darken, the firelight dimming to a faint glow. The moment his fingers brushed the mistletoe, a shock ran through him, and the world around him shifted. Images flashed before his eyes. A forest bathed in moonlight, shadows moving between the trees, and a figure standing at the edge of a frozen lake. He couldn't make sense of it, the visions coming too fast and fading too quickly. When he pulled his hand away, he stumbled back, his breath ragged. Elena caught him before he fell. "What happened?" she asked, her voice panicked. Nathan shook his head, trying to steady himself. "I saw something," he said. "I don't know what, but it felt real." They both turned to the mistletoe, its leaves glinting faintly in the firelight. Whatever it wasn't just a plant. It was something more, something ancient and powerful. And it wasn't done with them yet. Chapter 6. Whispers Beneath the Evergreen. Morning came reluctantly, veiling the forest in a shroud of gray. Snow still fell lightly, a feathery dusting that added to the endless white expanse surrounding the cabin. Inside, the air was thick with an unspoken tension. Nathan and Elena moved in separate orbits, neither quite ready to confront the events of the previous night. Nathan busied himself with the fire, coaxing it back to life after the long, cold hours of the night. His hands moved with practiced ease, but his thoughts were chaotic. The vision he had seen when he touched the mistletoe lingered in his mind, fleeting images of the forest and that shadowed figure by the frozen lake. It felt less like a memory and more like a warning, though he couldn't say why. Elena sat at the small table, her fingers tracing the worn edges of the journal. Her eyes were distant, fixed on some point beyond the cabin walls. She had always prided herself on her rationality, her ability to make sense of the world. But here, in this secluded place, surrounded by snow and shadows, rationality felt like a fragile thing. The mistletoe's presence, the strange sounds, the hum that seemed to come from nowhere, it all defied explanation. Finally, Elena broke the silence. "We can't ignore it anymore." Her voice was steady, though her hands betrayed her by tightening around the journal. "Whatever this is, it's not going away." Nathan didn't look up from the fire. "I'm not ignoring it," he said quietly. "I just don't know what to do about it." Elena stood and crossed the room to him, her footsteps barely audible against the wooden floor. "We have to figure it out," she said, her tone firmer now. "The mistletoe, the journal, the whatever it is we're feeling. It's all connected. Nathan finally turned to face her. His expression was guarded, but there was a flicker of something else in his eyes, reluctant agreement. "And where do we start?" he asked. Lena held up the journal. "Here. Whoever wrote this knew something. Maybe they didn't understand it completely, but they were closer to the truth than we are now." Nathan nodded, though his jaw tightened. "Fine. Let's start there." They sat together at the table, the journal open between them. Lena flipped through the pages slowly, her fingers careful not to damage the fragile paper. Many of the entries were mundane, detailing the writer's daily routines and observations of the forest. But interspersed among the ordinary were notes that hinted at something more. "The air feels heavier today. The silence is oppressive, as if the forest itself is listening. Another sprig of mistletoe appeared overnight. I don't know how it's happening. I've started keeping a tally. This is the 5th time. Dreams again last night. The lake, the shadows, always the same. What does it mean?" Lena read the entries aloud, her voice soft but steady. With each passage, the weight in the room seemed to grow heavier, the air thicker. Nathan listened intently, his mind racing to piece together the fragments of the mystery. "The lake," he said finally. "That keeps coming up. The writer saw it in their dreams, and I saw it last night." Lena looked at him sharply. "You think it's real?" Nathan shrugged. "I don't know, but it's something. A place to start." Lena nodded slowly. "If the lake is nearby, it might be marked on the map." They turned their attention to the faded map that Nathan had pinned to the cabin wall. It was old and incomplete, but it showed enough of the surrounding area to give them a sense of direction. Nathan traced a finger along the lines and symbols, pausing when he found a small, unlabeled body of water not far from the cabin. "Here," he said. "If it's the same lake, it's not far. We could get there on foot, assuming the snow isn't too deep." Elena's eyes narrowed. "Do you think it's safe?" Nathan met her gaze. "Probably not. But I don't think we have much of a choice." The decision made, they began to prepare. Nathan packed a small bag with essentials, water, food, and a flashlight. Lena dressed in layers, bundling herself against the cold. As they worked, the cabin seemed to hold its breath, the mistletoe above the hearth casting its shadow like a silent observer. When they finally stepped outside, the cold hit them like a physical blow. The snow was deep but manageable, and the air was crisp and still. The forest stretched out before them, its trees bare and skeletal against the gray sky. Nathan took the lead, his steps deliberate as he broke a path through the snow. Lena followed closely, her eyes darting to the shadows between the trees. The journey was silent, save for the crunch of snow beneath their boots. The forest felt alive in a way that neither of them could explain, as if it were watching their progress. The sense of being observed grew stronger with each step, a prickling at the back of their necks that refused to fade. After what felt like an eternity, they reached the edge of the lake. It was exactly as Nathan had seen in his vision, frozen and still, its surface reflecting the pale light of the overcast sky. The air here was different, heavier, as if the lake itself carried the weight of centuries. They stood in silence, taking in the sight. Then Lena spoke, her voice barely audible. "This is it. This is where it's all leading us." Nathan nodded, his jaw set. "Then let's find out why." As they stepped closer to the frozen water, the forest seemed to close in around them, its shadows deepening. And somewhere in the distance, so faint it was almost imperceptible, came the sound of a low hum. The same sound they had heard in the cabin, now rising from the heart of the lake. Chapter 7. The Spirit's Handiwork. The frozen lake stretched before them like a polished mirror, its surface unmarred by footprints or fallen snow. Nathan and Lena stood at its edge, their breath forming pale clouds that dissolved into the still air. The faint hum that had guided them here persisted, a sound that seemed to vibrate in their very bones. It was impossible to tell whether the noise came from above, below, or within. Lena knelt, reaching out a gloved hand to touch the ice. A shiver ran through her as the cold seeped through the leather, sharper and more biting than she had anticipated. Beneath the translucent surface, shadows twisted and shifted, their movements subtle yet deliberate. It was as though the lake held secrets just beyond the reach of sight. "There's something under there," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. Nathan crouched beside her, his expression grave. "Do you feel that?" he asked. "The air. It's different here. Heavier." Lena nodded. She had felt it too, a weight pressing down on her, making every breath an effort. It wasn't just the cold or the isolation. It was the presence of something unseen yet undeniably real. Her thoughts flicked back to the journal and the cryptic entries about the lake. The writer had known this place was significant, though they had never described what lay beneath. "We have to get closer," Nathan said, standing and offering Lena his hand. She hesitated for a moment before taking it, his warmth a welcome contrast to the chill. Together, they stepped cautiously onto the ice, their movements slow and deliberate. The lake held firm beneath their weight, the ice thick and unyielding. Yet every step felt precarious, as though the surface could give way at any moment. The hum grew louder as they ventured further out, a low and resonant tone that seemed to emanate from the center of the lake. It was no longer just a sound. It was a force pulling them forward. As they reached the midpoint, Nathan stopped abruptly. He crouched and placed his hand flat against the ice, his brow furrowing in concentration. "It's warmer here," he said, his voice tinged with disbelief. "Feel it." Lena followed his lead, pressing her palm to the frozen surface. He was right. The ice beneath her hand was noticeably warmer, almost as if something below was radiating heat. The shadows beneath the ice moved more actively now, swirling and coiling like smoke trapped in glass. Elena's pulse quickened. "What is this place?" she whispered, though she knew Nathan had no answer. Before either of them could move, the hum surged, growing louder and more insistent. The shadows beneath the ice coalesced, forming a distinct shape, a hand, outstretched and reaching toward them. Lena gasped, stumbling backward, but Nathan caught her arm, steadying her. "Did you see that?" she asked, her voice trembling. Nathan nodded, his jaw set. "We're not alone out here." The hand beneath the ice lingered for a moment before dissolving back into the swirling shadows. The hum quieted, returning to its previous steady pulse. But the air felt even heavier now, as though the lake itself was holding its breath. Nathan rose to his feet, his eyes scanning the expanse of ice around them. "We need to figure out what this is," he said. "There's got to be a connection to the journal, the mistletoe, all of it." Lena nodded, though her mind raced with doubt. What could they possibly do against something so intangible, so otherworldly? Still, she knew they couldn't turn back now. Whatever was happening, they were in the thick of it. As they made their way back toward the shore, the hum gradually faded, and the oppressive weight in the air lifted. By the time they reached solid ground, it was as if the lake had returned to its dormant state, silent and still. But the memory of what they had seen and felt lingered, a reminder that the calm was only an illusion. Back in the cabin, Nathan and Lena sat in silence, each lost in their thoughts. The journal lay open on the table between them, its pages filled with the musings of a long-gone writer who had walked the same path they were now treading. Lena traced her fingers over an entry she had read earlier, her mind piecing together the fragments of the mystery. The lake is alive, in its own way. It sees, it knows, and it waits. She looked up at Nathan, her resolve hardening. "We have to go back," she said. "We have to find out what's beneath the ice." Nathan's eyes met hers, and she saw the same determination reflected in his gaze. "We will," he said, "but not unprepared. Whatever this is, it's bigger than us. We need to understand it first." Elena nodded, though impatience gnawed at her. Every moment they spent away from the lake felt like a missed opportunity. But she knew Nathan was right. They couldn't afford to rush blindly into the unknown. As the fire crackled in the hearth and the mistletoe cast its shadow on the walls, the cabin felt both like a sanctuary and a trap. Outside, the storm had quieted, but the world beyond remained as enigmatic and unforgiving as ever. And in the heart of the frozen lake, something stirred, waiting for the moment to reveal itself. Chapter 8. Fragments of Yesterday. The days that followed were a blur of preparation and tension. The cabin, once a haven from the storm, now felt claustrophobic, as if the walls themselves conspired to keep Nathan and Elena trapped in their unease. The journal's cryptic entries became their guide, its inked words etched deeper into their minds with each reading. Yet the answers they sought remained elusive, cloaked in metaphor and mystery. Nathan spent hours poring over the map, tracing routes through the snow-draped wilderness. The lake, now a focal point of their unease, seemed to whisper to him even from a distance. He could feel its pull, an irresistible force urging him to return. Meanwhile, Elena dedicated herself to deciphering the journal's riddles. Her meticulous notes grew longer with each passing day, lines and arrows connecting fragmented thoughts as she tried to weave them into a coherent narrative. On the third morning, as the sky hung low and heavy with gray, Nathan made his decision. "We go today," he said, his voice resolute. "The longer we wait, the stronger this thing grows. We need to confront it before it's too late." Elena looked up from her notebook, her eyes tired but determined. "Agreed," she said, "but we're not going in blind. We need tools, something to give us an edge." They scavenged the cabin for anything that might prove useful. A rusted ice axe, a coil of rope, and a pair of old lanterns were added to their pack. Elena carefully wrapped the journal and her notes in oilcloth to protect them from the elements. Every item felt vital, as though it might be the difference between survival and succumbing to the unknown. By midday, they were ready. The snow had eased, leaving a brittle crust on the ground that crunched beneath their boots. The forest loomed, its skeletal branches clawing at the sky. Nathan led the way, his grip firm on the axe, while Elena followed close behind, her lantern swinging from her hand. The air was sharp and cold, each breath a sting against their throats. The journey to the lake felt different this time. The oppressive silence was broken only by the occasional creak of the ice or the distant rustle of unseen creatures. The hum that had haunted them on their first visit was absent, replaced by a stillness that was somehow more unnerving. It was as if the lake knew they were coming and waited in anticipation. When they reached the frozen expanse, the sight was as surreal as they remembered. The ice stretched out like a vast sheet of glass, reflecting the overcast sky. But now, faint fissures marred its surface, delicate cracks that spiderwebbed outward from the center. Nathan and Elena exchanged a glance, their unspoken agreement carrying them forward. They stepped onto the ice, their movements cautious and deliberate. The lanterns cast faint pools of light, their glow barely penetrating the surface beneath their feet. The shadows within the ice seemed more pronounced now, their shapes shifting and writhing like living things. With each step, the weight of the lake's presence pressed harder against them, an invisible force that threatened to overwhelm. As they reached the center, Nathan knelt and placed his hand on the ice. The warmth he had felt before was more pronounced now, a tangible heat that seemed to pulse in rhythm with the faint hum that had returned. "It's alive," he murmured, his breath fogging the air. "Whatever this is, it's alive." Elena crouched beside him, her gaze fixed on the shadows below. "Look," she said, her voice tight with fear and wonder. "They're moving toward us." Indeed, the shadows were converging, their indistinct forms coalescing into a single, larger shape. It was impossible to discern details, but the sheer size of it was staggering. The hum grew louder, resonating through their bodies, as if the lake itself was speaking to them. Elena reached into her pack and pulled out the journal, flipping to the page she had marked the night before. The entry described a ritual, vague and incomplete, but it was the only clue they had. The mistletoe is the key. Its power lies in connection. To break the veil, one must offer what was taken. Offer what was taken, she repeated under her breath, her brow furrowing. What does that mean? Nathan shook his head. I don't know, but if the mistletoe is involved, maybe we need to use it somehow. Elena pulled a sprig of the enchanted plant from her pocket, its vibrant green a stark contrast against the icy world around them. As she held it aloft, the hum surged, and the shadows beneath the ice reacted, swirling faster and rising closer to the surface. It's working, Nathan said, his voice tinged with both awe and terror. Keep going. Elena closed her eyes, focusing her thoughts on the journal's cryptic words. She held the mistletoe above the ice, her arms steady despite the tremor in her hand. The shadows rose higher, and the hum became a roar, a deafening cacophony that drowned out all other sound. Then, without warning, the ice beneath them cracked. A deep fissure opened, radiating outward from where they stood. Nathan grabbed Elena's arm, pulling her back as the ground shifted beneath their feet. The shadows surged upward, breaking through the ice in a blinding flash of light. When the light faded, the lake was silent once more. The fissures had vanished, and the ice was smooth and unbroken, as if nothing had happened. But Nathan and Elena knew better. Something had changed, though they couldn't yet understand what. They stood in stunned silence, the mistletoe still clutched in Elena's hand. Whatever they had awakened, it was far from over. The lake had revealed its power, but its secrets remained buried beneath the frozen veil. Chapter 9. The Dance of Shadows and Light. The crisp winter air hung heavy over the town of Hollyridge, as though it too was holding its breath. A fine dusting of snow had fallen the night before, coating the cobbled streets in a blanket of white that glistened in the morning light. The town square, usually bustling with the hum of holiday shoppers, was eerily quiet. A sense of unease seemed to cling to the air, as if something unspoken had passed between its inhabitants, something that was yet to be fully understood. Lena stood at the edge of the square, watching the few early risers go about their business. She had always loved the town's charm, the way the buildings seemed to huddle together for warmth, and how the holiday lights twinkled like tiny stars in the evening sky. But today, there was no cheer to the decorations, no warmth in the familiar sights. The mystery that had gripped Hollyridge was weighing down on her like an invisible chain. She tugged her scarf tighter around her neck and made her way toward the old bookstore. She hadn't spoken to Noah since their conversation the day before, but she couldn't shake the feeling that he knew more than he was letting on. He was clever, too clever at times, and his cryptic statements only made Lena more determined to get to the bottom of the mystery. The door to the bookstore jingled as she stepped inside, the warmth of the place offering a stark contrast to the chill outside. Shelves lined every wall, stacked high with books on every subject imaginable. The air smelled of old paper and faint hints of coffee, a combination Lena had always found comforting. But today, it felt like the walls were closing in on her, the stories contained within them somehow too real, too close. Noah was behind the counter, his head buried in a book, his usual easy demeanor absent. He glanced up as Lena approached, his eyes flicking to her face before quickly darting away. "Lena," he said, his voice strained. "I didn't expect you so early." She raised an eyebrow. "I'm not here for your usual morning coffee. I need to talk to you." Noah set the book aside, his hands clasping together as he leaned forward. "About what?" Lena hesitated. She had always trusted Noah, but now, with the mystery unraveling at her feet, she wasn't so sure. The letters, the symbols, the whispers in the wind, they all pointed to something dark, something that went beyond the simple mischief of a holiday prank. "I think we're being watched," Lena said quietly, glancing over her shoulder as if expecting someone to be lurking just out of sight. "And I think it has something to do with the mistletoe." Noah's expression remained unreadable, but his eyes flickered with something. Concern? Fear? "What are you talking about?" Lena shook her head. "You've heard the rumors, right? The ones about the mistletoe being cursed?" Noah didn't answer immediately, and the silence stretched between them like a taut wire. Finally, he stood up, the floorboards creaking under his weight. "You need to be careful, Lena," he said, his voice low. "Not everything is as it seems. Some things are better left untouched." Lena's heart quickened, a sense of urgency rising in her chest. "You know something, don't you? You've been acting strange ever since I found that letter, and I know you're hiding something. I need the truth. Noah, I can't do this alone." For a moment, Noah stared at her, his face shadowed by something that Lena couldn't quite place. Then, without another word, he reached behind the counter and pulled out a small, leather-bound book. The cover was worn, the edges frayed from years of use, and the title was almost illegible. He handed it to Lena, his fingers brushing hers as she took it. "This is the answer you're looking for," he said softly. "But be careful. It's a dangerous road to travel." Lena didn't need any more encouragement. She opened the book immediately, the pages yellowed with age. The writing inside was old, the ink faded, but the words were clear enough. The mistletoe, a symbol of love and joy, holds within it a power that cannot be easily controlled. In the hands of the wrong person, it can bring more than just affection. It can bring darkness. A curse is woven into its very leaves, waiting for the right moment to be unleashed. Lena's breath caught in her throat. She flipped through the pages quickly, her eyes scanning for more information. There were references to rituals, warnings about the mistletoe's power, and cryptic passages that seemed to speak in riddles. But one thing was certain: the curse was real. Suddenly, the door to the bookstore swung open with a loud creak, and Lena looked up, startled. A figure stepped inside, tall and cloaked in shadow. For a split second, her heart skipped a beat. Was it him? The one she had been warned about? Noah's face went pale, and he moved quickly to close the book. "You shouldn't have come," he muttered, his voice barely a whisper. The figure stepped closer, and Lena's breath hitched as she recognized him. It was Sheriff Cole, his face stern, his eyes dark with something she couldn't place. "I think it's time we had a conversation," he said, his voice low and menacing. Lena felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. The tension in the room was thick, almost suffocating. Whatever secrets Noah had been hiding were about to be dragged into the light, and there was no telling what it would mean for Hollyridge. Chapter 10. Secrets in the Ember's Glow. The door to the bookstore seemed to groan in protest as Sheriff Cole stepped inside, the harsh winter light casting a long shadow behind him. His boots clicked against the wooden floor, and Lena could feel the temperature drop in the room, as though the air itself had thickened with tension. Noah stood motionless behind the counter, his face pale, the once familiar warmth in his eyes replaced with something far colder. Lena's heart pounded in her chest as she realized that this was no ordinary visit. Sheriff Cole was a tall man, with broad shoulders that seemed to fill the doorway. His uniform, though neatly pressed, looked out of place in the cozy setting of the bookstore. His eyes, sharp and calculating, never left Lena as he crossed the room, his movements deliberate, his presence imposing. There was something in the way he carried himself, something unsettling, like a man who had seen too much and now carried a weight that he wasn't willing to share. "Lena," he said, his voice low, almost casual, but there was an edge to it. "I think we need to talk." Lena's mind raced. She had been prepared for many things today. Questions, confusion, even more cryptic clues. But not this. Not the sheriff. Not the man who was supposed to keep the town safe. Walking into the very place where all her suspicions had been leading. Noah didn't speak. He stood there, his hands tightly gripping the edge of the counter as though trying to steady himself. It was clear to Lena that this wasn't the first time Sheriff Cole had come here. In fact, it almost seemed like he had been expecting this moment. "What do you want, Sheriff?" Lena asked, trying to mask the fear creeping into her voice. "I've done nothing wrong." Cole's lips curled into a tight smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Oh, I'm not here to accuse you, Lena," he said, his voice softening just a fraction. "But I think you're getting too close to something that's better left alone." Lena felt her blood run cold at his words. She wasn't sure whether he was referring to the mystery of the mistletoe, the strange occurrences around the town, or something far darker. She glanced at Noah, who was still silent, his gaze fixed on the sheriff, and then back at Cole. "I don't know what you mean," Lena replied, her voice steady but her pulse quickening. "I'm just trying to figure out what's been happening in this town." Cole took a step closer, his shadow looming over her. "You don't understand, do you?" he murmured, his eyes darkening. "Hollyridge is a town with secrets, Lena. Secrets that go back generations. Some things are better left buried." Lena's stomach twisted. There it was again. The warning, the sense that something was being hidden from her. But what was it? And why was everyone acting so strangely? "What secrets?" she demanded, her voice trembling despite her best efforts. "What's been happening here?" Sheriff Cole's gaze flickered for a moment, and in that split second, Lena could see a crack in his composure. His fingers twitched, like he was about to reach for something, but instead, he took a deep breath and stood straighter. "Noah knows," he said quietly. "He's known for a long time. But it's not his secret to tell." Lena turned to Noah, whose expression was unreadable. He met her eyes briefly before looking down at the counter, as though avoiding her gaze. "What secret, Noah?" she asked, her voice softer now, pleading for the truth. "What aren't you telling me?" Noah remained silent, his jaw clenched. Lena could see the battle waging inside him, the internal struggle between his loyalty to the town and his desire to protect her. She could feel the weight of his indecision, the tension thickening in the air around them. Sheriff Cole, sensing her growing frustration, sighed. "You want the truth, Lena? The truth is that the mistletoe isn't just a harmless tradition. It's a symbol of something much darker, and it's tied to a curse that was placed on this town long ago." Lena's breath caught in her throat. She had suspected as much, but hearing it out loud, from the sheriff of all people, made the hair on the back of her neck stand on end. "What kind of curse?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Cole's lips twisted into a grim smile, but there was no humor in it. "A curse that has bound this town for generations. A curse that can only be broken under certain conditions, but only if the right person comes along and understands the danger in time." Lena's mind raced. She could feel the walls closing in around her. She had thought she was uncovering clues, slowly piecing together a mystery, but now it felt as though the pieces were slipping away from her grasp, leaving her with more questions than answers. "And what's that got to do with me?" she asked, her voice trembling. Cole's gaze locked onto hers. "You're the key, Lena. You've always been." You just didn't know it until now." Before Lena could respond, Noah finally spoke, his voice hoarse. "I didn't want to involve you, Lena. I thought I could protect you. But you've already seen too much." Lena's heart raced. She turned to Noah, her mind struggling to process what he was saying. "What do you mean? What do you know?" Noah hesitated, and then, with a deep sigh, he spoke. "The mistletoe, the letters, the symbols, the stories, they're all connected to the curse. The curse that was placed on this town to ensure that no one could ever escape its grip. And the only way to break it is to uncover the truth hidden in the past. But it's not something that can be done lightly. There are risks. And people, good people, have died trying." Lena felt her world tilt on its axis. She was the key. She was part of this twisted puzzle, and she hadn't even known it. The weight of the words pressed on her chest, and for the first time, she realized just how deep the mystery ran. The sheriff's voice broke through her thoughts. "The mistletoe is just the beginning. The real danger is far worse than you can imagine. And if you keep pushing, you'll find yourself in a place where there's no turning back." Lena looked from Noah to Sheriff Cole, her mind spinning with the revelations. The curse, the mistletoe, her role in everything. It was all too much to take in. "I don't care about the dangers," Lena said, her voice firm despite the fear swirling in her chest. "I'm not going to stop until I find the truth, no matter what it costs." The sheriff's eyes narrowed. "Then you've already made your choice," he said, his voice dark. "And there's no going back." Chapter 11. A Kiss to Forget. The world outside seemed to have grown darker as Lena stepped out of the bookstore, the weight of the sheriff's words pressing down on her chest like a stone. The cold air bit at her skin, but it was nothing compared to the chill that had settled deep within her. She had always known there was something wrong with Hollyridge, something hidden beneath its quaint, festive exterior, but she had never imagined it would lead her here, standing on the edge of a curse that stretched back generations. Noah's warning echoed in her mind. You're the key. But to what? And why had it been kept from her for so long? She had grown up in this town, played under the same mistletoe that now seemed to carry the weight of something far darker than she had ever understood. And yet, here she was, at the heart of it all, with no answers and no clear path forward. The town square, once a place of comfort, now felt suffocating, as though the buildings themselves were closing in on her. She could hear the faint hum of the wind, but it sounded distant, like an echo from another time. The streetlights flickered above, casting long, eerie shadows across the cobblestones. It was as if the entire town was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Lena walked aimlessly, her footsteps crunching on the fresh layer of snow. She needed answers, but where could she find them? The sheriff had been clear. There were risks to delving deeper into the mystery, but that only made Lena more determined. The more people told her to stop, the more she knew she couldn't. As she passed the old church at the edge of town, she noticed something that sent a shiver down her spine. The front door was ajar. The church had been abandoned for years, its once grand structure now weathered and worn by time. It was a place most people avoided, its dilapidated state a stark reminder of the past. But tonight, the door was open, as though someone, or something, was waiting for her. Lena paused, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The temptation to turn and run was strong, but something drew her forward, a pull she couldn't explain. She walked toward the door, her heart pounding in her chest. The moment she crossed the threshold, she was enveloped in darkness. The air inside was thick and musty, and the only sound was the faint echo of her footsteps on the creaky floorboards. She took a deep breath and reached for her phone, using the faint light from the screen to guide her way. The church was vast, its high ceiling barely visible in the gloom. Dust motes danced in the air, illuminated by the weak light from her phone. The pews, long unused, sat in rows, their wood rotting in places, the seats torn and battered by years of neglect. But what caught Lena's attention was the altar. It stood at the far end of the church, a shadowy figure in the dark. There, lying on the altar, was a bundle of mistletoe, its leaves dark and twisted, as though something had drained the life from it. It looked out of place, unnatural in its stillness, and Lena felt an icy grip tighten around her heart. Was this a sign? Or a trap? She stepped closer, her breath caught in her throat. The mistletoe glistened faintly, as if something deep within it was still alive. As her fingers brushed against it, the temperature in the room seemed to drop, and the air grew heavy, suffocating. She quickly pulled her hand back, but not before noticing something strange. A symbol carved into the wood of the altar, faint but unmistakable. It was a mark she had seen before in the letters in the old book Noah had given her. The same symbol that had haunted her thoughts since this mystery began. Lena stumbled back, her mind racing. What was this place? And why had she been led here? The darkness around her seemed to close in, the shadows lengthening, growing, like they were trying to swallow her whole. She needed to get out, but her feet felt rooted to the spot, as if the very ground beneath her was holding her captive. Suddenly, a voice broke through the silence. "You shouldn't be here." Lena's blood ran cold. She spun around, her heart leaping into her throat, but there was no one there. The voice had come from the shadows, deep and resonant, yet somehow distant. She glanced around frantically, but the church was empty, too empty. "You've come too far," the voice continued, now a whisper, barely audible over the pounding of her own heartbeat. "The curse has already begun, and now you're part of it." Lena's breath hitched in her throat. "Who are you?" she demanded, trying to keep the fear from her voice. But the silence that followed only deepened her unease. Then, from the corner of her eye, she saw something move. A figure emerged from the shadows, tall and thin, cloaked in black. The figure's face was hidden beneath a hood, but Lena could see the glint of something cold, beneath the shadow. The air seemed to pulse with an ancient energy, and Lena instinctively took a step back. "You've been chosen," the figure said, its voice hollow and cold. "There is no escape. The curse is in your blood." Lena's mind spun. The curse, her blood. What did it all mean? She had so many questions, but before she could ask another, the figure reached out a hand, and the mistletoe on the altar seemed to shimmer, alive with a strange, otherworldly light. "Leave now," the figure warned, its voice now a low growl. "You cannot stop what has already begun." But Lena stood frozen, her gaze fixed on the figure. She couldn't run. Not now. Not when she was so close to understanding. With trembling hands, she reached for her phone again, the light flickering erratically as though in response to the dark presence in the room. The figure didn't move as she stepped toward the exit, but its eyes, cold and empty, followed her every movement. As she pushed open the church door and stepped back into the biting cold of the night, Lena knew one thing for certain. She had uncovered a fraction of the truth, but it had only led to more questions. The mystery was far from over, and now the real danger had begun. Chapter 12. Hearts unraveled, hearts entwined. The wind had picked up by the time Lena stepped out of the church, its icy fingers curling around her like a warning. The once quiet town square was now eerily silent, the soft crunch of her boots the only sound cutting through the darkness. The fog that had rolled in earlier was thicker now, swirling around her, clouding her vision and heightening her sense of unease. Every step felt like it took her deeper into a trap, but there was no turning back. Her mind was a whirl of confusion and fear. The figure in the church, the one who had spoken in that hollow, chilling voice, Was it part of the curse? Or was it something else? Something tied to the town's dark past? Lena's pulse raced as she thought of all the things Noah had told her, the warnings, the secrets. She had always thought of Hollyridge as a town of quaint traditions, of peaceful streets and friendly faces. But now, it felt as if the very ground beneath her feet was turning against her. She had to find Noah. He was the only one who could help her make sense of everything, or so she hoped. But where could he be? She hadn't seen him leave the bookstore. The thought of him in danger made her stomach twist. He had been hiding something, but what if it was more than just a secret? What if he was caught up in something far darker than she realized? Lena's steps quickened as she made her way toward the familiar brick building, its lights still glowing warmly through the windows. But as she drew closer, she noticed something that stopped her dead in her tracks. The door to the bookstore was ajar, just slightly, as if someone had hurriedly left it open. Her breath caught in her throat. Had Noah left in a rush? She pushed the door open slowly, her heart pounding with a mix of dread and urgency. The dim interior of the bookstore greeted her, the shelves laden with books casting long shadows across the wooden floors. But something was wrong. The air was thick with tension, and the cozy atmosphere that had always defined the place now felt oppressive, claustrophobic. "Noah?" Lena called softly, her voice barely more than a whisper. No answer. She stepped further inside, her eyes scanning the room. The usual quiet hum of the store was absent, replaced by a deep silence that seemed to press against her eardrums. The faint scent of coffee still lingered in the air, but there was something else, something sharp and metallic. Lena froze, her eyes drawn to the floor. Blood. It was faint at first, barely noticeable, but as she stepped closer to the counter, the trail became clearer. There, smeared across the wooden floor, was a streak of blood, leading toward the back of the store. Lena's stomach churned, her pulse racing in her ears. She had to keep moving. She had to find Noah. She followed the trail, her steps slow and cautious, her breath shallow. The back door of the bookstore stood open, a gust of cold air swirling inside. The trail of blood continued out the door, into the alley behind the building, where the darkness seemed even thicker, the shadows deeper. Lena hesitated at the threshold, the sense of dread growing stronger. Every instinct told her to turn back, but she couldn't. Not now. She had come too far to back out. The alley was narrow, the walls of the buildings closing in on either side. Snow had started to fall again, the soft flakes mixing with the blood that stained the ground beneath her feet. She followed the trail until it led her to a small, abandoned shed at the end of the alley. The door was slightly ajar, and the faintest light flickered from within. Lena's heart skipped a beat. "Noah?" she called again, her voice shaking now. There was no reply. With a trembling hand, Lena pushed the door open, her heart pounding in her chest. The smell of old wood and mildew hit her instantly, but it was something else that made her stomach turn. The shed was small, barely big enough to hold a single person, but it was enough to conceal the horrors that lay within. Noah was there. He was slumped against the wall, his face pale and bloodied, his hands pressed to his side as though trying to stem the bleeding. His eyes fluttered open at the sound of her footsteps, and a weak smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. "Lena." His voice was hoarse, barely a whisper, but the relief in his eyes was unmistakable. "You shouldn't have come." Lena rushed to his side, her hands trembling as she knelt beside him. "What happened? Who did this to you?" Noah winced, his face contorting in pain as he tried to sit up. I didn't expect them to find me. I thought I could stop it, but it's too late. They've already started." "Who?" Lena demanded, her voice tight with fear. "Who did this to you?" He glanced toward the back of the shed, his eyes widening in fear. "The figure, the one from the church. They've been following me. watching me. The curse, it's real, Lena. I tried to protect you, but now it's out of control. Lena's breath hitched. The figure, the one she had seen in the church, the one who had spoken in that hollow voice. It was all connected. She could feel it now, the truth starting to sink in. The town, the mistletoe, the blood. It was all part of something far larger than she had imagined. "They're coming," Noah whispered, his eyes darting nervously around the room. "You have to leave. They'll find you too." Lena shook her head, her resolve hardening. "No, I'm not going anywhere. Not until I understand what's happening. We need to stop this. We need to finish it." Noah's gaze softened, a mix of pride and sorrow in his eyes. "You don't know what you're asking, Lena. There's no stopping it now. The curse, it's already been set in motion. It's in your blood. They're coming for you next." Suddenly, the door to the shed slammed open with a force that made Lena jump. A figure stood in the doorway, tall and cloaked in shadow, its face hidden beneath a dark hood. The air around them grew colder, the weight of the presence pressing down on her. "Noah." The voice was the same one Lena had heard before, cold and menacing. "You failed, and now she'll join you in the darkness." Lena's breath caught in her throat as she reached for Noah, but it was too late. The figure moved toward them, and the world around Lena seemed to spin out of control. There was no escape. Chapter 13. The Maze of Memory. Lena's heart pounded in her chest as the figure in the doorway loomed, its shadow stretching across the cold, wooden floor of the shed. The air grew thick, as though the very atmosphere had become dense with malice, a suffocating force pressing in on her from every side. She wanted to scream, to run, but her legs felt frozen, as if they were no longer her own. All she could do was stare at the figure, an imposing presence, dark and almost otherworldly. Noah's hand clutched hers weakly, and she could feel his pulse, rapid and weak against her skin. His face was pale, the blood from his wounds now staining the floor, his body limp against the wall. There was no strength left in him, no fight. "They found me," Noah muttered, his voice a soft rasp. "And now, they found you too." Lena shook her head, trying to clear the haze of panic clouding her thoughts. This wasn't how it was supposed to end. She couldn't let it end like this. She couldn't allow herself to be swallowed by this darkness, not when she was so close to uncovering the truth. The figure in the doorway stepped forward, its long, flowing cloak trailing behind it like a shadow. It was taller than any person Lena had ever seen, its posture unnaturally straight, as though it was a being beyond human. Its face remained hidden, concealed beneath the dark hood that blocked any attempt to discern its features. But Lena could feel its eyes, unseen, but felt in the marrow of her bones. They were watching her, judging her. "You shouldn't have come," the figure spoke again, its voice deep, almost a growl. The words were like a weight, pressing against Lena's chest, suffocating her. She stood her ground, her voice trembling but defiant. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice louder than she intended. "What do you want from me?" The figure tilted its head slightly, as if considering her question. "I am the one who has watched over this town for centuries," it said slowly, the words laced with ancient bitterness. "I am the keeper of the curse. And you, Lena, are the final piece of the puzzle." Lena's mind raced. The keeper of the curse? She had heard whispers of something like that. Stories in the dark, old legends told in hushed tones. But this was real. This was happening, and it was all tied to her. She had known it, felt it deep inside her, but hearing it spoken aloud made it all the more terrifying. You don't understand," Lena said, trying to steady her breathing. "I'm not part of any curse. I'm just trying to figure out what happened. I want to stop it." The figure chuckled, the sound cold and hollow, as if the very essence of joy had long since left it. "You cannot stop what has already begun, child," it said. "The curse was placed long before you were born. It is written in your blood, in the very soul of this town. You cannot break what has already been set in motion." Lena felt a chill creep up her spine as the figure moved closer. Every step it took seemed to drain the warmth from the room, the shadows lengthening with each passing moment. She had to do something, anything, to fight back. But before she could think of a plan, Noah's weak voice interrupted her thoughts. "Lena, listen to me," he whispered, his breath ragged. "You need to leave. It's too late for me, but you can still escape." Lena's gaze snapped to him, her heart breaking. "I won't leave you," she said firmly, shaking her head. "We'll figure this out together. We'll stop this thing." Noah's eyes, dull with pain and regret, met hers. "You can't. The curse, it's tied to the bloodline. Your bloodline. It's why they've come for you. They've been watching for generations. Your family. They were the ones who started it." Lena's breath caught in her throat. Her family? What was Noah saying? She had no idea what he meant. Her family had always been quiet, ordinary people. How could they be connected to this dark history? They? Lena asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Who are they?" Noah's eyes fluttered closed, and for a moment, Lena thought he had fallen unconscious. But then he spoke again, his voice barely audible. "The ones who placed the curse. The ones who are coming for you. They are the keepers of the mistletoe, and they are not human." The words hung in the air, heavy and final. The keeper of the mistletoe. Not human? Lena's mind reeled. What did that even mean? The figure in the doorway stepped closer still, now just a few feet away. It was towering, its presence oppressive. And still, it remained silent, watching her with unseen eyes. Lena tried to swallow the rising lump in her throat, her mind racing. She was the key to all of this. Her blood, her family, the curse. It was all tied together. But how? What did it all mean? "Please," she whispered, her voice desperate. "I need to know. What is this curse? What do you want with me?" The figure finally spoke again, its voice low and reverberating through her bones. "The curse is a bond that was forged long ago, a bond that links this town to something beyond the living. The mistletoe is its anchor, its symbol. And you, Lena, are the heir to that bond. Your blood carries the legacy of those who invoked it." Lena's eyes widened. The mistletoe, the symbol. It was all connected to her family. But how could she be tied to something so monstrous? She had never felt anything but love and peace in her home, surrounded by the traditions her family held dear. She couldn't reconcile that with the horror standing before her. "Why?" she asked, her voice shaky. "Why me?" The figure stepped closer, its cloak brushing the ground like a whisper in the dark. "Because you are the last of your line. And when the time comes, when the stars align and the mistletoe blooms under the full moon, you will fulfill your family's pact. You will complete the circle. You will awaken what has been dormant for centuries." Lena stumbled back, her hands gripping the doorframe for support. Awaken what? Her blood ran cold. What was she supposed to awaken? What had her ancestors done? The figure raised a gloved hand, and in that moment, Lena realized that the darkness wasn't just surrounding her. It was seeping into her. She could feel it in her veins, crawling beneath her skin, wrapping around her heart. "No!" she shouted, her voice ringing out in defiance. "I won't let you use me. I won't let this happen." The figure did not respond. Instead, it raised its hand higher, and the air grew even colder, the shadows growing darker still. It was then that Lena knew. This was the moment everything changed. The moment she could either break the cycle or fall into the abyss. Her pulse quickened, and as the figure's shadow reached for her, Lena took a deep breath, her decision solidifying in her heart. This wasn't the end. This was just the beginning. Chapter 14. The Blossom Beneath the Snow. Lena's heart hammered in her chest, the rhythm erratic as her mind fought to make sense of the nightmare unfolding before her. The figure in the doorway, the shadow that seemed to consume all light, was moving closer. She could feel its power, like an invisible force pushing against her, a weight she could barely breathe under. She had never felt so small, so powerless. But she would not let it control her. Not now. Not when she was this close to uncovering the truth. She took a step back, her foot landing in a puddle of blood. It was warm. Her stomach churned at the thought, but she forced herself to focus. You are not alone. You are not powerless, she reminded herself. The figure was not just a figure. It was a symbol, a manifestation of something far older than she could comprehend. And if it was real, if the curse was real, then she had to fight back. No, Lena shouted again, louder this time, her voice ringing with defiance. I won't let you win. Not like this. The figure paused, its dark presence still pressing in around her. It made no sound, offered no response. But Lena could feel the pressure intensify, as if it were trying to force her into submission, to make her give in. But she wouldn't. She couldn't. Not with Noah here, broken and barely conscious, blood staining his hands. He needed her, and she needed to understand what this was all about. She had come too far to let it end like this. Please, Noah, she whispered urgently, turning toward him. His eyes were half-lidded, his face ghostly pale, but he was still alive, still holding on. Tell me what I need to do. You said there was a way to stop it. Tell me now. Noah's hand twitched, and for a moment, Lena thought he might not respond. But then he gasped, his voice barely audible. The mistletoe. It's the key. You are the key. Lena's pulse quickened as the words struck her like a bolt of lightning. The mistletoe. The strange plant that had always held such significance in Hollyridge. The one that grew wild in the forests around the town. The one that was connected to every legend, every whisper about curses and old secrets. She had always thought it was just a symbol of holiday cheer, an innocent tradition. But now, she saw the truth. The mistletoe was no simple plant. It was an anchor, a vessel for something far older, far darker, and it was tied to her bloodline. Tell me what to do, Noah, she begged, her voice shaking. Please, don't leave me alone with this. I don't understand. Noah struggled to sit up, his face contorted with pain, but his determination was clear. His eyes locked with hers, filled with a mixture of fear and urgency. The curse, it started with your ancestors. They made a pact with something that has been waiting for centuries to be freed. The mistletoe was its bond. The bloodline is its key. Lena's stomach lurched. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. Her ancestors had made a pact with something unnatural. And now, she was the one who had to face it. I don't want this, Lena whispered, her voice barely a tremor. I didn't ask for this. Noah's gaze softened, but his words were firm. None of us do, but it's our bloodline. And now, it's your turn. If you don't stop it, the cycle will continue, and worse things will come. Lena took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. The weight of what Noah had just said pressed down on her, but she couldn't falter now. She had to finish this, for herself, for Noah, and for the town that had unknowingly lived under the shadow of this curse for generations. As she stood there, facing the looming figure in the doorway, the temperature seemed to drop even further. The wind howled outside, the sound distant, as if coming from another world. It was then that Lena realized the truth. The figure wasn't just a messenger. It was a harbinger of the curse's power, a being that had been waiting for the bloodline to awaken. The figure lifted its hand once more, and a cold, unnatural light began to emanate from its fingers. The air in the shed shimmered, vibrating with an eerie energy that seemed to hum through the floorboards. Lena could feel the presence of the mistletoe, as if it were calling to her, beckoning her forward. "Lena," Noah rasped, his hand reaching out toward her. "The only way to break the curse is to sever the bond. You have to destroy the mistletoe, the source of its power. It's tied to the land, to your family, and to you. You have to destroy it before the full moon rises. That's the only way." Lena's heart skipped a beat. The full moon. She remembered the old stories, the ones that talked about the mistletoe's power during the winter solstice, when the moon was at its peak. But how could she destroy something so deeply rooted in the land? The mistletoe was part of everything, part of the town, part of her family, part of the very air she breathed. She looked back at the figure, standing motionless in the doorway, its form an embodiment of the curse. It was waiting for her to make her choice. And in that moment, Lena understood. She wasn't just fighting for her life. She was fighting for the soul of the town, for the lives of everyone who had been caught in the curse's web, for Noah, who had sacrificed so much to warn her, for herself. With renewed resolve, she turned back to Noah. "I'll do it," she said, her voice trembling but steady. "I'll destroy the mistletoe." Noah gave her a pained smile, his eyes filled with gratitude. "You're strong, Lena. Stronger than you know." Lena glanced at the door to the shed, where the figure still stood, unmoving. The time was almost up. The full moon would rise soon, and she had no more time to waste. She had to act now. "Noah, I won't let this curse continue. I will end it tonight, no matter the cost." With one last glance at the man who had guided her this far, Lena turned toward the door. The cold wind hit her as soon as she stepped outside, but it was a relief, a small comfort. She could feel the weight of the curse lifting as she moved, step by step, toward the heart of the town. The mistletoe waited, and so did she. Chapter 15. The Ghost of What Might Be. The night was still, the kind of stillness that felt unnatural, as though the world itself were holding its breath. Lena could feel the weight of the curse hanging in the air, thick and suffocating. A dark cloud that loomed over Hollyridge. It pressed down on her chest, made every step feel heavier than the last, but she kept moving forward. There was no turning back now, not with the full moon rising above the treetops, its pale light casting long shadows across the snow-covered ground. She had never ventured this far into the woods before. The forest surrounding Hollyridge had always been a place of mystery and superstition, a place where the locals whispered about things that should not be known. Yet here she was, walking deeper into the heart of it than she had ever dared. She had to find it, the mistletoe, the heart of the curse. It was the only way to end it, to stop whatever had been set in motion centuries ago. Lena's breath came in short bursts, the cold air biting at her skin, but it was the fear that truly made her shiver. The figure in the shed, the keeper of the curse, had made it clear. She was the key. Her bloodline was tied to the darkness that had cursed the town. The mistletoe was the vessel, and now she had to destroy it. With each step, the forest seemed to close in around her. The trees grew denser, their branches intertwining above her, blocking out the moonlight. She felt as though the very earth beneath her feet was conspiring against her, trying to drag her down into the shadows. But she could not afford to be afraid. She had come too far. The wind howled through the trees, a mournful sound that seemed to echo the fear that churned in Lena's gut. The silence of the woods was broken only by the crunch of her boots in the snow and the faint rustling of branches in the breeze. But it wasn't the wind that unsettled her. It was the feeling that she was being watched, that something or someone was waiting for her in the dark. She gripped the flashlight tighter, its beam cutting through the thick darkness. The mistletoe. She needed to find it before it was too late. She had no idea where it was, but the legends she had heard growing up danced in her mind. The mistletoe always grew in places of power, places where the earth and the sky seemed to meet. And the forest was full of places like that. She just had to find the right one. As she walked, Lena's thoughts turned to Noah. His warning still echoed in her mind. The mistletoe was the key. But to what? What was she about to awaken? She hadn't been ready to face the truth when Noah had first told her, but now she couldn't deny it. Her bloodline, her family, they were all part of something much bigger, much older than she had ever imagined. They had made a pact long ago, and now it was her turn to fulfill it, or to end it once and for all. The sound of movement behind her stopped her in her tracks. Lena's heart lurched, her breath caught in her throat. She turned, the beam of the flashlight sweeping across the snow, but there was nothing, just the trees, standing like silent sentinels, their branches swaying in the wind. She took a slow breath, trying to steady herself. There was no time to waste. She had to focus. As she moved deeper into the forest, the air grew colder, and a strange stillness settled around her. It was as though the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. And then she saw it. A clearing. A place where the trees parted just enough to let the moonlight shine through. In the center of the clearing stood a single tree, its gnarled branches twisted and reaching toward the sky. And there, at its base, was the mistletoe. It was unlike anything Lena had ever seen. The mistletoe was large, its leaves dark and glossy, its berries glowing faintly in the moonlight. It hung from the branches like a twisted crown, a symbol of power and darkness. Lena could feel it, a pulse of energy coming from the plant, vibrating in the air around her. It was as if the mistletoe itself were alive, aware of her presence, waiting for her to make a move. She took a step forward, her breath shallow, her heart pounding in her chest. The mistletoe was the key to ending the curse, but could she destroy it? Could she sever the bond that had held the town in its grip for so long? She had no choice. The darkness was closing in, and there was no going back. Lena hesitated for a moment, looking at the plant, feeling the pull of it, the ancient force that had been tied to her family for generations. It called to her, a quiet whisper in her mind, urging her to take it, to claim it, but she knew better. This wasn't hers to control. It was a force of nature, one that had been set in motion long before she was born. And now it was time to stop it. Taking a deep breath, Lena stepped forward again, her hand trembling as she reached out for the mistletoe. She didn't know what would happen when she touched it, but she couldn't be afraid anymore. This was the moment everything changed. Her fingers brushed the mistletoe, and the world seemed to shift. A sudden gust of wind swept through the clearing, the trees creaking as if in protest. The mistletoe trembled beneath her touch, its berries pulsing with a light that seemed to come from within. The air grew colder, the shadows deepened, and the ground beneath her feet seemed to tremble. Then, with a sharp crack, Lena pulled the mistletoe free from the tree. The moment she did, a wave of energy surged through her, a violent rush of power that nearly knocked her to the ground. It was as if the very earth beneath her had shifted, as if the curse that had bound the town for centuries had been torn loose. For a moment, everything was still, and then, from the darkness, the figure appeared. It was the keeper, the harbinger of the curse. But now, it was different. Its form was more solid, its presence more menacing. It stood before her, its cloak swirling around it like a living thing, its eyes hidden in shadow. "You've done it," the figure said, its voice a low growl, filled with ancient fury. You've broken the bond. Lena stood her ground, the mistletoe still clutched in her hand. She could feel its power fading, the curse weakening, but she knew the fight wasn't over. This was just the beginning. You won't win, Lena said, her voice steady. The curse ends here. The figure's laugh was hollow, echoing through the trees like the sound of death itself. You cannot stop what is already in motion, it said. The curse will never be undone. But Lena wasn't listening anymore. She raised the mistletoe high, her eyes locked on the figure before her. And as the full moon reached its peak, she threw the mistletoe into the air, watching as it shattered into 1,000 pieces, the power of the curse unraveling before her eyes. The figure let out a final, deafening scream as the darkness around them began to dissipate, the shadows lifting, the cold air beginning to warm. The power of the curse was finally broken, and in that moment, Lena knew. The mystery had been solved. The curse had been defeated, and Hollyridge was free. Chapter 16. Falling Stars and Rising Flames. The morning after the curse was broken, the town of Hollyridge seemed to awaken from a long, forgotten slumber. The skies were clear, and the sun shone brightly through the trees, casting long, golden rays over the snow-covered ground. The oppressive darkness that had hung over the town for generations was gone, replaced by a sense of peace that Lena had never known before. She stood at the edge of the forest, staring into the clearing where the mistletoe had once hung, now nothing more than fragments scattered across the earth. It was over. The curse was no longer a shadow looming over Hollyridge. Lena could hardly believe it. The events of the past few days felt like a dream, too surreal, too twisted to be real. Yet here she was, standing in the same woods where she had uncovered the secrets of her bloodline, the same place where she had confronted the figure that had been pulling the strings for so long. It felt like a lifetime ago. The weight in her chest had lifted, and though the past was still there, lingering in the back of her mind, she could finally breathe. But there was more to be done. The town would need time to heal. People would need answers. And Lena had to be the one to provide them. She wasn't sure how she could, or even where to begin, but she knew one thing for certain. She couldn't do it alone. Turning away from the clearing, Lena made her way back toward the town. The streets of Hollyridge were quiet, the usual bustle of daily life absent for the moment. But the town wasn't empty. People were stirring, gathering in small groups, exchanging looks of uncertainty and curiosity. They knew something had changed, but they didn't yet understand what. Noah was still at the cabin, recovering from the ordeal, his body weak but alive. He had played his part in helping her uncover the truth, guiding her through the darkness when she had no idea where to turn. She owed him more than she could ever express, but that would have to wait. Right now, she had a town to address. As Lena walked down the main street, she could feel the eyes of the townsfolk on her. Some looked at her with relief, others with suspicion. The mystery had been solved, but many questions remained unanswered. She needed to give them something, some sense of closure, some understanding of what had happened, and how they could move forward. She stopped at the steps of the old town hall, the building where so many of the town's secrets had been kept hidden for years. The doors were open, and inside, a small crowd had gathered. The mayor, an older man with a permanent frown etched into his face, stood at the front of the room, speaking to the crowd in hushed tones. He stopped as Lena entered, his gaze locking on her with a mixture of relief and suspicion. "Lena," the mayor said, his voice wavering slightly. You've returned." She nodded, taking a deep breath. "Yes, it's over," she said, her voice steady, though she could feel the weight of all the eyes on her. "The curse is broken. Hollyridge is free." There was a collective murmur in the room, a ripple of disbelief and wonder. But the mayor didn't seem entirely convinced. "And what does that mean for us, Lena?" he asked, his voice low, almost cautious. What happens now? Lena stepped forward, her eyes sweeping over the crowd. She recognized many faces, some familiar from her childhood, others she hadn't seen in years. The fear that had once gripped the town still lingered in their eyes. But there was also hope. Small, fragile, but there nonetheless. What happens now is up to us, Lena began, her voice carrying across the room. We rebuild. We heal. We face the truth about what's happened here. And we make sure nothing like this ever happens again. The mayor nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. And what about the mistletoe? He asked. The legends, they were real, weren't they? Lena's heart skipped a beat. It was strange to hear the word legends used so casually, after all the fear and mystery that had surrounded them for so long. But the legends were true, and they had all led to this moment. Yes, she said, her voice steady. The mistletoe was the anchor. The curse was tied to it, and to my family. But that's over now. The curse has been broken. The mistletoe is destroyed. We don't have to live in fear anymore. The room was silent for a long moment. Then, a woman in the back of the room stood up, her face lined with age and worry, but her eyes filled with a quiet strength. What about the others? She asked, her voice trembling slightly. The others who were lost because of this curse. What happens to them? Lena felt a lump form in her throat. She had thought about this question, about the families who had suffered, about the lives that had been lost over the years. How could she ever make up for that? How could she explain that some things could never be undone? We can't change the past, Lena said softly, but we can honor them. We can make sure they are never forgotten. And we can make sure nothing like this ever happens again. The woman nodded, wiping a tear from her eye, and sat back down. The rest of the room fell into a quiet murmur, people exchanging uncertain looks, but also a sense of understanding. The weight of the curse was finally lifted, but there was still much to be done. Lena took a deep breath and looked around the room, at the faces of the people she had known her whole life, at the town that had shaped her. She had always felt like an outsider here, always looked at with suspicion, always trying to figure out what her place was in the world. But now, it seemed as if Hollyridge was finally ready to accept her, to let go of the past and build something new. I know this won't be easy, Lena said, her voice firm, but filled with resolve. But we have a chance now, a chance to start over, to make this town a place we can all be proud of. It's going to take time. It's going to take effort. But we can do it. The crowd nodded in agreement, and for the first time in a long time, Lena felt the weight of their gaze shift from suspicion to something else, something she couldn't quite name, but something that felt like hope. As she left the town hall and stepped back into the cold morning air, Lena felt a strange sense of peace settle over her. The mystery had been solved. The curse had been broken. Hollyridge was free. And for the first time in her life, she felt like she was too. Chapter 17. The Mistletoe's Truth. Days had passed since the curse was broken, yet Lena couldn't shake the feeling that something still lingered, a faint echo from the past that whispered to her when the world went quiet. Hollyridge was healing. She could feel it. The people were beginning to rebuild, to return to their lives, their fears slowly being replaced with hope. But the town wasn't the only one that had been touched by the curse. It had marked her, too. The weight of everything she had learned, the secrets unearthed, and the choices she had made. It all seemed to cling to her like the shadow of the mistletoe itself. Lena hadn't returned to the cabin since the night she destroyed the cursed plant. Noah had insisted he needed time to recover, and although she visited him once or twice a day, there was a part of her that hesitated, unsure of what to say or how to act. There was a quiet tension between them, unspoken but palpable, as though the resolution of the curse was merely the beginning of a new chapter that neither of them was quite ready to write. She spent her days wandering through the town, checking in with the mayor and helping wherever she could. She had become something of a symbol to the people of Hollyridge. They no longer looked at her with suspicion, but with respect, with gratitude. In some ways, that only made the weight heavier. The burden of being the one to break the curse, to end the suffering, was not one she could easily bear. One afternoon, as the crisp autumn air swept through the town, Lena found herself walking toward the cemetery. It had been years since she had visited her family's graves. Her parents had died when she was young, and the town had never allowed her to forget the mysterious circumstances surrounding their deaths. For as long as Lena could remember, the townspeople had always whispered about the accident that claimed their lives. But the truth was far more complicated than anyone knew. The curse, after all, hadn't begun with the mistletoe. It had begun with them. As Lena approached the cemetery gates, the weight of the past seemed to settle over her once more. The graves were quiet, their stones weathered by time, but the memories they held were as sharp as ever. Her parents' grave, marked with a simple stone bearing their names, stood near the back of the cemetery, almost hidden by overgrown ivy and thick trees. Lena walked toward it slowly, her heart heavy with thoughts of what had been and what might have been. Her mother had always been a strong, quiet woman, a presence that was both comforting and distant. She had been the one to teach Lena the importance of patience, of waiting for the right moment. But it was her father who had been the one to warn her of the dangers lurking in the town, of the legacy that had been passed down to her. He had never spoken of the curse directly, but his warnings had been clear. There had always been something in his eyes, a kind of fear that Lena had never fully understood until now. When Lena reached the grave, she knelt down, brushing the leaves away from the stone. The names of her parents were etched into the cold granite, but there was no date of death, no explanation of what had happened to them. No one had ever spoken of the truth. She had always suspected that there was more to their deaths than anyone had let on, but she had never pushed for answers. Until now, Lena placed her hand on the stone, her fingers trembling slightly. "I did it," she whispered to the quiet grave. "The curse is broken. The town is free." She let the words hang in the air, her breath coming in soft bursts as she tried to steady herself. "But what about you? What happened to you? Why didn't you tell me?" The wind stirred the trees around her, sending a chill down her spine. Lena stood and backed away from the grave, her mind racing. What had her parents known? Why had they kept it from her? She had spent so much time focused on the curse, on the mistletoe, on breaking the hold over the town, that she had never once stopped to question how deep her family's involvement truly ran. Was her bloodline part of something even darker than she realized? A rustling sound broke through her thoughts, and Lena turned quickly, her heart pounding in her chest. She was alone in the cemetery. She had been alone. But now it felt different. Something was out of place. A shadow seemed to stretch across the ground in front of her, though there was no one around. It was as if the past itself had come alive, reaching out to her, demanding to be acknowledged. And then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw him. Noah stood at the entrance of the cemetery, his figure framed by the fading light of the afternoon. He looked different, more determined, more resolute. His clothes were weathered, his expression solemn, but there was something in the way he looked at her that made Lena's breath catch in her throat. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice barely more than a whisper, though she wasn't sure why she was surprised to see him. She had expected him to follow her, to come after her eventually, but the way he stood there, watching her, made her feel as though the walls between them had come crashing down, as though there was no space left for either of them to hide. Noah stepped forward slowly, his gaze never leaving hers. "I've been looking for you," he said quietly. "I think it's time we talked." Lena felt her heart skip a beat. They hadn't really talked since that night in the woods when she had destroyed the mistletoe. She hadn't known what to say, what to feel, and he hadn't offered her any answers. Their connection had been strained, the silence between them a heavy thing neither of them knew how to break. But now, standing in the cemetery, she realized there was something she needed to hear, something she needed to understand. "I know," she said, her voice shaking slightly, "but I'm not sure I'm ready." Noah stopped in front of her, his expression softening. "I think we both need closure, Lena," he said, his voice low, gentle. "Not just for the town, but for us." Lena looked at him, at the man who had stood by her side through the darkest moments of her life, who had helped her unravel the mystery of the curse, and yet still seemed like a stranger in so many ways. There was so much she wanted to say, so much she wanted to understand. But the past had a way of pulling them both back, holding them captive in its grip. "Maybe," she whispered, "but the past, it's not just gone. It's still here. I can feel it." Noah nodded slowly, his eyes dark with something that seemed like understanding. "I know, but maybe together we can face it." For the first time in days, Lena allowed herself to breathe, to let go of the tension that had built inside her. She wasn't alone anymore, and though the mysteries of her family's past still loomed large, she had someone beside her, someone who understood the weight of it all. The sun was setting behind the hills, casting the cemetery in a soft golden light, and for the first time since the curse was broken, Lena felt a glimmer of peace. The past had shaped her, but it didn't have to define her. She wasn't alone anymore, and whatever came next, they would face it together. Chapter 18. Love Remembered, Love Eternal. The days that followed Lena's encounter with Noah in the cemetery felt like a blur, a series of fragmented moments where the pieces of the past slowly began to take shape. The town of Hollyridge continued its quiet recovery, but Lena could not escape the feeling that something more was waiting to be uncovered. There were too many unanswered questions, too many layers to the story of the mistletoe, her parents, and the curse that had bound them all together. Noah had left the cemetery that day without a word, leaving Lena standing in the soft golden light, lost in thought. But as the days passed, he had kept his distance, giving her space. Yet Lena could sense that something had shifted between them. There was an unspoken understanding now, a shared weight, a shared purpose. But neither of them was ready to face it fully. Not yet. Lena spent much of her time walking through the town, searching for the answers she hadn't yet found. She had a sense that the curse was only part of the story, that it had roots deeper than anyone could have imagined. She needed to know more about her family, about her parents. She needed to understand what had happened to them and why they had kept so many secrets. One afternoon, after a quiet breakfast in the small cottage she now called home, Lena decided to go to the town library. It was an old building, the kind that seemed to hold more dust than books, with shelves that creaked and whispered in the silence. But it was the only place in Hollyridge where she might find any answers. The librarian, Mrs. Everett, was a woman of few words, but Lena had always felt there was more to her than met the eye. She had been in town for as long as anyone could remember, and her knowledge of Hollyridge's history was vast. Perhaps she knew something about Lena's parents, or about the events that had set the curse in motion. As Lena entered the library, the musty scent of old paper and ink greeted her, and the quiet stillness wrapped around her like a cloak. Mrs. Everett was sitting behind the counter, as usual, her glasses perched on the end of her nose as she sorted through a stack of papers. When she saw Lena, she looked up, her expression unreadable. "Lena," she said with a small nod. "Back again, I see." Lena smiled faintly, though she could feel the weight of her mission pressing down on her. "I was hoping you could help me with something," she began, her voice steady. "I need to know more about my parents, about what happened to them." Mrs. Everett's eyes flickered with something, a brief flash of recognition, maybe even concern, but she didn't say anything at first. Instead, She stood and walked toward the back of the library, where rows of old bookshelves stretched into the shadows. Lena followed, her footsteps echoing in the quiet room. "There are records," Mrs. Everett said, her voice low. "Records about the founding families of Hollyridge. Your parents were part of that history, weren't they?" Lena nodded. "They were. But there's so much that doesn't make sense. So many unanswered questions. I need to know what happened to them." The librarian stopped in front of a dusty shelf near the back, pulling a thick leather-bound book from the top. It was old, its pages yellowed and fragile, but it felt significant, like a relic of a forgotten past. Mrs. Everett blew the dust off the cover and handed it to Lena. "This is the town ledger," she said, her tone cautious. "It's been here for generations. It holds records of the families who built Hollyridge, those who laid its foundations, both in blood and in spirit." Lena accepted the book, her fingers brushing over the worn cover. She opened it carefully, turning the yellowed pages with reverence. The names of the town's founders were written in meticulous script, some of them crossed out, others highlighted. As she flipped through the pages, she paused at a section where her parents' names were listed: Eleanor and Samuel Harrow. The entry was brief, but it was enough to stop her heart for a moment. The entry read, "Eleanor and Samuel Harrow, founders of the Harrow lineage, died under mysterious circumstances, suspected to be linked to the curse of the mistletoe. Their deaths marked the beginning of a series of tragedies tied to the mistletoe's power." Lena's breath caught in her throat. The words "mysterious circumstances" echoed in her mind, and she read the sentence again, her hands trembling. She had known there was something strange about her parents' deaths, but this was something else. The curse had been tied to them. Her parents had been part of the very thing that had haunted Hollyridge for so long. Mrs. Everett watched her closely, as though she was waiting for Lena to process the information. "There's more," she said quietly, "but not all of it is written down. Some things are better left unsaid, I suppose. The truth, however, is always there, waiting to be uncovered." Lena closed the book with a soft snap, her mind racing. "What do you mean? What more is there?" Mrs. Everett's expression hardened, and she turned away, as if unwilling to reveal more. "There are things in this town, dark things, that go beyond what you read in books. The curse of the mistletoe is only the surface. You don't know everything, Lena." "Not yet." Lena's pulse quickened. "What are you trying to say?" Mrs. Everett sighed, as though debating whether to continue. Finally, she spoke, her voice low and heavy with years of hidden knowledge. "Your parents weren't just victims of the curse, Lena. They were part of something much bigger. They were involved in a pact, one that goes back centuries. They thought they could break the curse, just like you did, but they failed. And because of that failure, they became part of the mistletoe's power." Lena's heart sank. She couldn't comprehend what Mrs. Everett was telling her. Her parents had been involved in the curse, not just as victims, but as active participants? She couldn't fathom it. "But why didn't they tell me?" Lena whispered, feeling the weight of her own confusion and disbelief. "Why didn't they prepare me for this?" Mrs. Everett's gaze softened, a mixture of sympathy and sorrow in her eyes. "Some things are too dangerous to share, Lena. Some knowledge, some power, can consume you. They tried to protect you from it. They never wanted you to carry that burden." Lena stood frozen, the truth slowly unraveling in her mind like a tangled thread she couldn't stop pulling. Her parents had known. They had known everything. And now, it seemed, it was her turn to face it. The weight of their legacy, of their mistakes, was now hers to bear. "I have to go," Lena said, her voice barely more than a whisper. She turned and walked toward the door, the town ledger still clutched tightly in her hands. As she stepped out of the library and into the cold air, the weight of everything she had learned pressed down on her chest. She didn't know what to do with this new knowledge, or how to reconcile the truth of her parents' involvement with the person she had always believed them to be. But one thing was clear: Hollyridge's secrets ran deeper than she had ever imagined, and now it was up to her to finish what they had started.